For thousands of people, it was supposed to be the holiday of a lifetime. A week of fine dining, endless entertainment, sunsets over the Mediterranean, and the quiet reassurance that they were travelling aboard one of the safest forms of transport in the world. Children laughed in the swimming pools, champagne flowed in the restaurants, musicians played into the evening as couples danced beneath glittering chandeliers. No one knew that, in just a few minutes' time, the ship beneath their feet would be fighting for its life. Just after 9:45 on the evening of the 13th of January 2012, the Costa Concordia drifted closer to the tiny island of Giglio than she ever should have. On the bridge, experienced officers watched glowing radar screens. Below them, more than 4,000 people continued with their evenings, completely unaware that disaster was only seconds away. Then, a deafening roar echoed through the hull. Steel screamed against granite. The entire ship shuddered violently. Wine glasses crashed to the floor, lights flickered, people grabbed their tables. Some laughed nervously, others froze. No one yet understood what had happened. Deep below the waterline, a gash more than 50 meters long had been torn into the ship's side. The sea poured inside. Within moments, watertight compartments were flooding. Electrical systems began to fail. The engines lost power, and one of the largest cruise ships in Europe had already begun to die. Yet above deck, passengers were being told there was nothing to worry about, that it was just an electrical problem. Some returned to their meals, others went back to their cabins. Every passing minute made escape more difficult. Every reassuring announcement stole precious time. Hours later, as families climbed down rope ladders, as terrified passengers jumped into freezing black water, as rescue boats raced towards a ship now lying helplessly on her side, the man responsible for every soul aboard was no longer there. In the hours that followed, one conversation between a Coast Guard commander and the captain of the Costa Concordia would become one of the most famous emergency radio exchanges ever recorded. We'll come back to that moment later, because before anyone could ask why the captain wasn't on the ship, we first needed to understand how one of the safest places in the world became one of the deadliest. 32 people would lose their lives. Thousands more would carry the memories for the rest of theirs. This wasn't simply the story of a ship that hit a rock. It was the story of routine becoming complacency, confidence becoming arrogance, and a series of decisions that changed thousands of lives forever. This is the Costa Concordia disaster. Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I'm Matt, and I'm your host. If you'd like to support the show, you'll find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. You can also follow the podcast on all the socials, and if you'd like to suggest a case or get in touch, you'll find my contact details there too. And as always, if you enjoy the show, please consider following, leaving a rating, and sharing the podcast with someone who loves true crime and real-life mysteries. Every recommendation genuinely helps the show reach more people. Before we begin, this episode discusses death, traumatic injuries, and a major maritime disaster. It also contains one instance of strong language, quoted in both Italian and English from an official emergency radio transmission. It has been included because it forms an important part of the historical record. Listener discretion is advised. Alright, let's crack on with the show. At first glance, the Costa Concordia didn't look like a ship. She looked like a city, Stretching almost 300 metres from bow to stern, she towered above the water like a gleaming white apartment block. 13 passenger decks, more than 1,500 cabins, 4 swimming pools, 5 restaurants, 13 bars, a theatre seating over 1,000 people, shops, a casino, a spa, even a Formula One racing simulator. Everything had been designed to make passengers forget they were at sea. Launched in 2005 for the Italian cruise company Costa Concordia, the Concordia was one of the largest passenger ships ever built in Europe. At over 114,000 gross tons, she represented the modern cruise industry's promise that bigger meant better. More passengers, more luxury, more destinations. On paper, she was also remarkably safe. Modern cruise ships are built with multiple watertight compartments, sophisticated navigation systems, powerful radar, and highly trained bridge crews. Every voyage is planned in advance. Every officer follows internationally recognised procedures. Every captain is entrusted with thousands of lives. For most people, boarding a cruise ship feels safer than getting into a car, and statistically, it usually is. By January 2012, the Costa Concordia had completed hundreds of successful voyages through the Mediterranean. For many of her crew, this was simply another week at work. For returning passengers, it was another relaxing holiday. There was nothing unusual about the evening of Friday the 13th of January. The ship had departed the port of Civitavecchia, northwest of Rome, earlier that day, beginning a 7-night cruise around the western Mediterranean. More than 3,200 passengers from around 60 countries were on board, along with just over 1,000 crew members. Families, newlyweds, retired couples, groups of friends, children excited for their first cruise. Many had spent months planning this holiday. Some were celebrating birthdays, other anniversaries. For a few, it was the first time they'd ever seen the Mediterranean. As darkness settled over the sea, restaurants filled with conversation. Waiters carried plates between crowded tables. Music drifted through lounges and bars. In the theatre, performers prepared for the evening show. Elsewhere, passengers wandered the open decks, looking out across the calm January water. It felt routine, comfortably routine, and that sense of routine began on the bridge. Commanding the Costa Concordia that evening was Captain Francesco Schettino. By 2012, Schettino had spent decades at sea. He'd worked his way through the merchant marine before joining Costa Cruises, eventually becoming one of the company's captains. Among colleagues, he was regarded as technically competent and experienced. He'd commanded large passenger vessels before and knew the Mediterranean well. To the passengers enjoying dinner below, his name meant very little. What mattered was the uniform, the 4 gold stripes on his shoulders, the confidence that came with experience. When passengers stepped aboard a ship like the Costa Concordia, they placed an extraordinary amount of trust in people they would probably never meet. Trust that the captain knew exactly where he was going. Trust that every decision was based on safety. Trust that someone somewhere on the bridge was always in control. It's a remarkable thing when you think about it. Thousands of complete strangers, sleeping, eating and relaxing, on a floating city surrounded by open water, because they believed the people in charge would always make the right decisions. Most of the time, the trust is rewarded. On the evening of the 13th of January 2012, it wasn't. Because while passengers laughed over dinner, a decision was beginning to take shape on the bridge. It wasn't made in panic, it wasn't forced by bad weather, it wasn't the result of an emergency. It was a choice, one that would bring the Costa Concordia dangerously close to the tiny island of Giglio and begin one of the most infamous maritime disasters of the 21st century. For centuries, captains have paid their respects to coastal communities. a long blast of the ship's horn, away from the bridge, sometimes a little closer to shore than usual. In Italy, the tradition even had a name: l'inchino. Translated into English, it means the bow, or more accurately, a salute. Cruise ships would occasionally alter their planned course, passing close to an island or harbour to greet local people, company officials or retired captains who lived along the coastline. It wasn't an official manoeuvre, it wasn't part of international navigation procedures, but neither was it unheard of. When carried out safely, it had become something of a tradition within parts of the Italian cruise industry. Passengers loved it. Standing on deck as enormous ships glided surprisingly close to land created unforgettable holiday photographs. People ashore often gathered to wave back. It looked spectacular. But spectacular and safe are not always the same thing. The Costa Concordia departed Civitavecchia that afternoon, bound for Savona, with scheduled stops that would take passengers around the western Mediterranean over the following week. The weather couldn't have been much better. The sea was calm, visibility was good, there was no storm, no heavy swell, no emergency forcing the ship off course. Everything about the evening suggested another routine voyage. Yet some time after leaving port, a decision was made. Captain Francesco Schettino intended to perform an inchino off the coast of Giglio Island. The island sits just off the Tuscan coast, a picturesque community of only a few thousand residents. Known for its fishing, narrow streets and rugged granite shoreline, Schettino knew the area very well. He had sailed these waters before. According to evidence later heard in court, he also wished to salute someone on the island with connections to Costa Cruises. The planned route would take the Concordia much closer to Giglio than a standard passage. The intention wasn't to stop, it wasn't to dock, simply to pass close enough for the ship's horn to echo across the island. On paper, it probably didn't seem like an extraordinary decision. Large passenger ships had sailed close to Giglio before. The difference was exactly how close. On the bridge, sophisticated navigation equipment continuously displayed the ship's position. Electronic charts, GPS, radar, depth information, every tool a modern captain could ask for. But no technology, no matter how advanced, can overcome a decision to ignore its warnings. As the Concordia altered course, officers monitored the change in position. The granite coastline slowly drew nearer. To passengers on deck it was exciting. People pointed towards the lights scattered across the island. Some took photographs, others commented on how close they seemed to be. Few realised that a vessel of the Concordia's size doesn't turn quickly. Travelling at around 16 knots, nearly 30 kilometres an hour, it needed considerable distance to change course safely. Every second mattered. Every metre mattered. The island itself offered no room for error. Beneath the calm surface lay underwater rock formations that local fishermen knew well. They'd been there for centuries. They weren't hidden. They were marked on nautical charts used by professional mariners. One of those rocks, a submerged granite outcrop known as Luscol, sat just beneath the surface, harmless unless a ship ventured too close. At 9:45 p.m, the Costa Concordia continued towards Giglio. Passengers applauded as the ship sounded its horn. On shore, residents looked out across the dark sea at the brilliantly illuminated cruise ship. For a brief moment, it was exactly the spectacle Captain Schettino had intended. A floating city, saluting a quiet island. No one watching from shore could have imagined that in less than a minute, those lights would become the backdrop to one of the worst maritime disasters in modern European history. And somewhere ahead, waiting silently beneath the surface, was solid granite. Granite that had waited millions of years. Granite that wasn't moving. The Costa Concordia was. At 9:45 p.m, the Costa Concordia was travelling at approximately 16 knots. The lights of Giglio glowed just ahead. Passengers stood on open decks, watching the island drift closer. Inside the restaurants, dinner service continued. Wine was being poured. Children were laughing. In the theatre, the evening performance was underway. To almost everyone on board, it felt like the highlight of the cruise. On the bridge, the atmosphere was changing. The coastline was now far closer than it should have been. Captain Francesco Schettino had delayed the turn, intending to bring the ship close to shore before altering course away from the island. It was a manoeuvre that relied on precise timing. Every second counted. Every degree of rudder mattered. But a ship the size of Costa Concordia doesn't respond instantly. Unlike a car, you don't simply turn the wheel and change direction. A vessel weighing more than 114,000 tons carries enormous momentum. Even after the helm is put over, it continues travelling forward, responding gradually. That delay would prove fatal. The order to turn came. The ship began responding, but not quickly enough. Ahead, almost invisible in the darkness, lay the granite reef known as Le Shoal. Just beneath the surface, waiting, at 9:45 p.m, the inevitable happened. The port side of the Costa Concordia slammed into the submerged rocks. The sound was indescribable. Passengers later spoke of a violent grinding noise, like metal being torn apart. Others compared it to an explosion. The entire ship lurched. Tables shook violently. Glasses smashed onto restaurant floors. People were thrown from their seats. Some instinctively grabbed onto anything they could reach. Others looked around in confusion. For a few seconds, nobody knew whether they had hit another ship, run aground, or suffered some kind of mechanical failure. Deep below the waterline, the damage was catastrophic. The jagged granite tore a gash stretching roughly 50 metres along the port side of the hull. It ripped through several watertight compartments. Within seconds, thousands of tons of seawater were pouring into the ship. The flooding reached vital machinery spaces. Electrical equipment began failing. The main engines lost power. Generators shut down. Lights flickered, then failed altogether in parts of the ship. Air conditioning stopped. Lifts froze where they were. Without propulsion, without electrical power, the Costa Concordia was no longer under proper control. She was drifting. On the bridge, the seriousness of the situation was becoming painfully clear. Officers worked rapidly to assess the damage. Information arrived in fragments. Flooding, engine failure, loss of propulsion, loss of electrical systems. Every new report painted a darker picture. Captain Schettino now faced a decision unlike any in his career. He knew the ship had suffered a major hull breach, but he didn't yet know whether she could be saved. Down below, passengers were asking questions. Crew members tried to reassure them. Some genuinely didn't yet understand the scale of the emergency. Others were simply repeating the information they'd been given. Then came the announcement. Passengers were informed there had been an electrical problem. Nothing more. The request was simple. Please remain calm. The situation was under control. For many people, those words were enough. Why wouldn't they believe them? The captain had decades of experience. The crew remained composed. The ship was still afloat. Most passengers returned to exactly what they'd been doing moments before. They finished their meals, collected their belongings, walked back towards their cabins. None of them realised that below their feet, the sea was still pouring in. Every minute that passed made the situation worse. Captain Schettino made one decision that almost certainly prevented an even greater catastrophe. Realising the ship was no longer recoverable, he steered the powerless vessel towards the shallower waters off Giglio's harbour. Using what momentum remained, together with the ship's anchor and the natural drift of the vessel, the Costa Concordia eventually came to rest close to shore rather than sinking in much deeper water. That decision almost certainly saved many lives, but it didn't undo what had already happened. because by the time the ship grounded, thousands of people were still on board. Many had no idea how serious the situation had become, and the clock was still ticking. The collision had lasted only seconds. The consequences would last all night. In any major emergency, the first few minutes matter more than almost anything else. Training, communication, leadership, they can mean the difference between a controlled evacuation and complete chaos. On the Costa Concordia, those first few minutes would later become the focus of intense scrutiny. Not because the collision itself could be undone, but because what happened afterwards would shape everything that followed. The impact had been impossible to ignore. Passengers had felt it, crew had felt it, the officers on the bridge knew the ship had suffered serious damage. Yet throughout much of the vessel, normality was still being encouraged. The announcement describing an electrical fault had brought the crew time, but it also created a dangerous illusion. Many passengers believed exactly what they were being told. After all, why wouldn't they? They were on one of the most modern cruise ships in Europe. The captain hadn't ordered an evacuation. The crew weren't running through the corridors. There were no alarms telling people to abandon ship. For most, the safest thing seemed to be staying exactly where they were. In the restaurants, some people carried on eating. Others joked nervously about the sudden jolt. A few even raised their glasses and laughed, assuming the interruption would soon be over. In bars and lounges, conversations resumed. Parents tried to reassure frightened children. Cabin stewards continued answering questions they couldn't yet fully answer themselves. Some crew members genuinely believed the situation might still be brought under control. Others were beginning to realise the truth. But they were waiting for clear instructions from above. That uncertainty filtered through the entire ship. Meanwhile, below the waterline, the sea wasn't waiting. Thousands of tons of water continued flooding into the damaged compartments. The ship was becoming heavier by the minute. The list to starboard grew more noticeable. At first it was subtle, just enough for passengers to feel slightly off balance. A wine bottle rolling across a table, a chair slowly sliding across polished flooring, a lift no longer sitting perfectly level. Small things, easy to dismiss on a moving ship, until they weren't. As the angle increased, crew members began struggling to move equipment. Doors no longer stayed where they were opened. Objects that had seemed perfectly secure moments earlier started drifting across the decks. Passengers who had returned to their cabins noticed coat hangers swinging, drawers sliding open, bathroom doors refusing to stay shut. The ship itself was giving them a warning. Most still didn't understand what it meant. On the bridge, the reality had become impossible to ignore. The Concordia had lost propulsion. Several watertight compartments had flooded. Electrical systems were failing. The captain and his officers were trying to understand the full extent of the damage while coordinating with the engine room, company officials, and the Italian Coast Guard. Information arrived in fragments. Some reports contradicted others. Every minute brought another problem. There was no single switch that could reverse what had happened. Only decisions, and every decision now carried enormous consequences. As valuable time slipped away, some passengers decided not to wait for instructions. They made their own way towards the open decks. What they found was unsettling. Crew members were gathering. Lifeboats were still hanging in place. There was activity, but no clear explanation. Questions spread faster than answers. What's happening? Have we hit something? Why is the ship leaning? No one seemed able to give the same response twice. Then, the list became impossible to ignore. Walking in a straight line suddenly took effort. People instinctively reached for handrails. Children clung tightly to their parents. Glasses slid from tables without anyone touching them. The mood had changed. Not all at once, but steadily. The laughter disappeared. Conversations became whispers. Curiosity turned into concern, and concern was slowly becoming fear. Later investigators would examine those critical minutes in extraordinary detail, not because they believed every life could have been saved, but because they wanted to understand whether the evacuation should have been sooner, whether passengers should have been told the truth earlier, whether precious minutes had been lost. Those questions would dominate courtrooms, inquiries, and public debate for years. But for the people still trapped aboard the Costa Concordia, none of that mattered yet. They weren't thinking about investigations, or responsibility, or criminal charges. They were simply looking at a ship that was leaning further with every passing minute, and wondering whether they were going to get off. For more than an hour, passengers had waited. They had listened to announcements, watched crew members hurrying through corridors, felt the ship leaning a little further every few minutes. Now, there was no pretending any longer. The Costa Concordia was dying. At around 10:58 p.m, more than an hour after the collision, the order was finally given. Abandon ship. For thousands of people, those two words came with equal parts relief and terror. Relief because they finally knew the truth. Terror because they now had to escape a vessel that was no longer level beneath their feet. Cruise ships are designed for orderly evacuations. Passengers gather at their assigned muster stations. Crews provide life jackets. Lifeboats are lowered in sequence. People board calmly. The system depends on one crucial assumption: that the ship remains reasonably upright. The Costa Concordia wasn't. By the time the evacuation began, the list had become severe enough to make moving around increasingly difficult. Walking uphill through a corridor on a ship isn't something most people have ever experienced, but that's exactly what many passengers were suddenly forced to do. Floors had become slopes, staircases felt almost vertical, handrails became lifelines. Parents lifted children into their arms, elderly passengers clung to strangers. Crew members formed human chains in places where people struggled to keep their footing. Furniture broke free and slid across polished decks. Suitcases tumbled through passageways. Every moment became harder than the last. Outside, the lifeboats hanging on the higher side of the ship could still be launched. Those on the lower side were becoming increasingly difficult to use. As the angle increased, gravity began working against the evacuation itself. Every minute made launching another boat more complicated. Every minute meant fewer options. Despite the chaos, many crew members displayed extraordinary courage. Stewards who had spent the evening serving dinner now guided frightened families towards the decks. Housekeeping staff helped elderly passengers negotiate steep staircases. Entertainment staff abandoned their performances and began directing crowds to safety. Some remained at their posts until there was almost no safe way for them to leave. In the years that followed, many survivors would remember those acts of quiet bravery far more vividly than the mistakes made elsewhere. On board were people from around 60 different countries. Many spoke little or no Italian, others spoke little English. Crew members found themselves giving urgent instructions in several languages at once, pointing rather than speaking, using gestures instead of words, trying to make themselves understood over alarms, shouting, and the groaning sound of a ship slowly rolling onto her side. Some passengers reached the lifeboats quickly, others weren't so fortunate. Families became separated in confusion. Parents searched desperately for children. Partners lost sight of one another in crowded stairwells. Some would spend hours believing the person they loved was still trapped somewhere inside the ship. As the Costa Concordia continued settling onto the seabed, the angle became so steep that people were no longer simply walking across the decks. They were climbing. In some areas, passengers had to pull themselves along corridors using handrails mounted on what had once been the walls. What had been floors were becoming walls. What had been walls were becoming floors. A ship designed to carry more than 4,000 people safely across the sea had become a maze. Those who managed to reach the open decks were met by another challenge. The January air was cold. The sea below was darker still. Rescue boats from Giglio had begun heading towards the ship. Local fishermen, harbour authorities, emergency services, ordinary residents. Many had seen the brightly lit liner from their homes. Now they could see something was terribly wrong. Without waiting to be asked, many launched their own boats. They didn't know how many people they would find, only that people needed help. Throughout the evacuation, acts of kindness appeared everywhere. Passengers helping complete strangers, crew carrying children, people refusing to leave without elderly relatives, others giving away life jackets to those who needed them more. In disasters, history often remembers the failures, but it should also remember the courage, and on the Costa Concordia that night, there was no shortage of it. Yet while thousands fought their way towards safety, questions were already beginning to circulate. Where was the captain? Who was in command? And why did so many people seem unsure what to do next? Those questions would soon lead to one of the most famous emergency radio exchanges ever recorded. But first, the evacuation still had hours to run, and for some, escape was becoming impossible. By now, hundreds of passengers had reached safety. Others were still making their way through the listing ship. Some remained trapped inside. The Costa Concordia now lay on her starboard side, partially submerged, just off the coast of Giglio. What had once been polished corridors and elegant staircases had become steep, confusing obstacles. Rescue boats continued arriving. Helicopters circled overhead. Emergency crews from the island worked through the darkness. For many, the nightmare was only just beginning. On the bridge, the chain of command had broken down. Officers were scattered between different locations. Communications were becoming increasingly difficult. The emergency response had shifted from preventing a disaster to trying to save as many lives as possible. Captain Francesco Schettino was no longer on board. Exactly how he came to leave the ship would become one of the central questions of the investigation. Schettino would later say that he had fallen into a lifeboat after the ship lurched violently. Prosecutors argued that he had abandoned the vessel before the evacuation was complete. That disagreement would become one of the defining issues at his trial. What isn't disputed is that he was ashore while the evacuation was still ongoing. At the headquarters of the Italian Coast Guard, Commander Gregorio De Falco was trying to understand what was happening. Reports suggested passengers were still trapped aboard. Lifeboats were still being launched. The evacuation wasn't over, yet the captain wasn't on his ship. De Falco called Schettino by radio. What followed would become one of the most famous emergency conversations ever recorded. Before I continue, rather than using the original recording, I'm going to read part of the exchange myself. I'll keep the most famous line in the original Italian, before translating into English. At first, the conversation was controlled, professional. De Falco wanted one thing, for the captain to return to his ship and take charge of the evacuation. Schettino continued explaining the situation. He said the ship was listing badly, that rescue boats were alongside, that he couldn't simply climb back aboard. Then, De Falco's patience finally snapped. Vada a bordo, cazzo! In English, get back on board for fuck's sake. There was no shouting for effect, no attempt to create drama. This was a Coast Guard commander who believed there were still people aboard a sinking ship, and he was speaking to the man legally responsible for every one of them. Schettino continued trying to explain why returning wasn't possible. De Falco interrupted. Lei si rifiuta. Are you refusing? Another pause, and then another order. Lei adesso mi sale a bordo e mi dici quante persone ci sono. You are to get back on board immediately and tell me how many people are still there. Every sentence carried the same message. Go back, take command, do your duty. That exchange would be heard around the world. New organisations replayed it repeatedly. In Italy, those 4 words, Vada e bordo cazzo, became part of the national conversation. For many, they represented everything a captain is expected to do. Remain with the ship, lead the evacuation, leave last. Whether every decision made that night was fair to judge in hindsight would be debated for years. But in that moment, Commander De Falco believed there were still lives depending on the man he was speaking to. Back aboard the Costa Concordia, the evacuation continued. Crew members who had never expected to face a disaster of this scale kept helping passengers towards safety. Firefighters searched flooded compartments. Divers prepared to enter spaces that were now almost impossible to navigate. Some passengers escaped by lifeboat, others climbed down ropes. A few had no choice but to jump into the freezing January sea before being pulled aboard rescue boats. The people of Giglio, many of whom had watched the collision from their windows, opened churches, schools, restaurants, and their own homes. Blankets were handed out, hot drinks were prepared, dry clothes were found. Strangers comforted strangers. On an island with only a small permanent population, an entire community suddenly found itself caring for thousands of survivors. As dawn approached, the Costa Concordia lay silent against the rocks. The brightly lit floating palace that had left port just hours earlier now resembled a stranded giant. Rescuers knew one thing. Not everyone had made it out. The rescue operation was becoming a recovery operation. The world now wanted answers. How had one of the most sophisticated cruise ships ever built ended up lying on her side, just a few hundred metres from shore? And who would ultimately be held responsible? As the first light of dawn broke over Giglio, the full scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. The Costa Concordia, once one of the most recognisable cruise ships in Europe, now lay motionless against the rocky shoreline. She listed at more than 60 degrees. Her enormous white hull, usually a symbol of luxury and escape, had become a twisted monument to disaster. From the island, residents stood in silence. Just hours earlier they had watched the Concordia glide proudly towards them, her decks illuminated like a floating city. Now, she looked broken, almost unreal. Throughout the night, thousands of passengers had been brought ashore. Many arrived wearing only life jackets and the clothes they had escaped in. Some had no shoes. Others had left passports, wallets and medication behind. Children clung to exhausted parents. Couples searched desperately for one another. Friends stared out towards the wreck, hoping everyone they had travelled with had made it off safely. For many, no one knew who was alive and who wasn't. The people of Giglio responded with extraordinary compassion. Hotels opened their doors without hesitation. Restaurants prepared food for complete strangers. Churches became emergency shelters. Schools welcomed families who had nowhere else to go. Volunteers distributed blankets, dry clothing, hot drinks, mobile phone chargers, anything they could find. The island had a population of only around 1,500 people, yet within hours it was caring for thousands more. In the middle of one of Europe's worst maritime disasters, human kindness quietly took centre stage. Out at the wreck, the rescue operation continued. Firefighters entered the ship wherever it was safe to do so. Divers searched flooded compartments beneath the waterline. Coast Guard crews worked alongside specialist rescue teams, moving carefully through corridors that no longer resembled corridors. Floors had become walls, walls had become ceilings. Every doorway was disorientating. Every room had to be approached as though it were upside down. Inside, the silence was unsettling. Only the sound of water, the groaning of twisted steel, and the occasional crack as the ship settled further onto the rocks. Search teams moved methodically, cabin by cabin, deck by deck. Every space had to be checked. They knew some passengers might still be alive, trapped, injured, unable to reach the exits. Time mattered, but rushing could cost rescuers their own lives. The wreck remained unstable. At any moment, it could shift again. As the hours turned into days, hope slowly gave way to reality. One by one, the missing were identified. In total, 32 people lost their lives in the disaster. They came from different countries, different backgrounds, different generations. Some were passengers enjoying long-awaited holidays. Others were crew members simply doing their jobs. Every one of them had boarded the Costa Concordia expecting to return home. None of them knew that a routine evening sail past would become the last night of their lives. For the survivors, the physical escape was only the beginning. Many would later describe recurring nightmares, anxiety around water, a fear of travelling, feelings of guilt for surviving when others didn't. Some spoke of the grinding sound of steel against rock, replaying in their minds for years afterwards. Others remembered something far quieter, the eerie silence. Immediately after the impact, when nobody yet understood what had happened. Disasters don't always end when the rescue boats arrive. For many people, they continue long after the headlines disappear. Meanwhile, questions were growing louder. Why had the ship sailed so close to Giglio? Why had the evacuation taken so long to begin? Could more lives have been saved? And perhaps the biggest question of all, how much responsibility rested with one man? Investigators now faced an enormous task. They would analyse radar data, voyage recordings, bridge procedures, electronic charts, witness testimony, and every decision made before and after the collision, because somewhere inside thousands of pages of evidence lay the answers. The Costa Concordia had stopped moving. The investigation was only just beginning. Within hours of the Costa Concordia coming to rest against the rocks of Giglio, investigators had already begun arriving. The immediate priority was still rescue, but from the very beginning, there was another question that needed answering. How had one of the most advanced passenger ships in the world ended up ripped open on a reef that appeared on every modern nautical chart? The answer wouldn't come from a single witness or a single recording. It would take years to piece together. The wreck itself became the largest piece of evidence. Everything was preserved: bridge instruments, electronic navigation systems, engine data, voyage records, radio communications. The ship's voyage data recorder, often described as the maritime equivalent of an aircraft's black box, contained vital information about the vessel's speed, heading, helm orders and bridge conversations. Investigators now had something incredibly valuable. Not opinions, not rumours, data. The electronic charts confirmed what many had already suspected. The Costa Concordia had deliberately left her normal route. This wasn't a navigational error caused by bad weather. There was no storm, no mechanical failure that forced the vessel towards land. The deviation had been intentional. The aim? To perform an inchino, a close pass by Giglio that would create a memorable spectacle for those on board and those watching from the island. But the evidence showed something else. The ship had passed closer to shore than intended. By the time the turn away from the island began, there simply wasn't enough sea room left. Attention quickly turned to what happened on the bridge. Large passenger ships are never operated by one person alone. Captains rely on bridge teams, senior officers, navigation officers, helmsmen, each with clearly defined responsibilities. Modern bridge resource management is built on one simple principle: no one person should carry the burden of every critical decision. Teamwork is a safety system. Investigators examined whether that system had broken down. Were concerns raised early enough? Were they communicated clearly? Did anyone challenge the captain's decision? Or had confidence in the captain prevented people from speaking up? Those questions became central to understanding the disaster. The investigation also focused on the evacuation itself. Why had passengers initially been told there was only an electrical problem? Why was there a significant delay before the order to abandon ship? Could those lost minutes have changed the outcome? Experts recreated the timeline almost minute by minute. The collision, the flooding, the loss of propulsion, the emergency calls, the public announcements, the abandonment order. Every decision was placed under the microscope. Not to rewrite history, but to understand whether different choices could have reduced the loss of life. Investigators also examined Captain Francesco Schettino's actions after the collision. His decision to steer the powerless ship toward the shallows of Giglio almost certainly prevented an even greater catastrophe. Had the Concordia drifted into much deeper water, a full evacuation would have been vastly more difficult. That manoeuvre was recognised during the investigation, but it sat alongside other decisions that came under severe criticism. The route taken, the delayed evacuation, and his departure from the ship before the evacuation had been completed. The investigation wasn't looking for a simple hero or a simple villain. It was trying to establish responsibility based on evidence. As more witnesses came forward, a clearer picture began to emerge. Passengers described confusion, conflicting instructions, announcements that reassured them long after the seriousness of the situation was becoming apparent. Crew members spoke about communication difficulties, the rapidly increasing list of the ship, the challenge of launching lifeboats. Emergency responders described an operation made far harder by the delay and the ship's changing position. Each statement added another piece to an increasingly complex puzzle. The tragedy also prompted difficult questions for the wider cruise industry. Should close passing manoeuvres like the inchino have been allowed at all? Were companies placing too much emphasis on spectacle? Did bridge teams feel able to challenge captains when they believed a decision carried unnecessary risk? Around the world, maritime authorities watched closely, because the answers wouldn't only affect the Costa Concordia. They could shape the safety of future voyages. For Captain Schettino, the investigation was steadily becoming something else. A criminal case. Prosecutors believed the evidence pointed towards multiple serious failures. His lawyers argued that the disaster was more complicated than a single decision or a single individual. The courtroom would eventually become the place where those competing arguments were tested. But before any verdict could be delivered, the Costa Concordia herself still had one final chapter to write. Because moving a ship of that size, from where she lay, would become one of the most ambitious and technically demanding salvage operations ever attempted. The world had watched her sink. Now, it would watch an extraordinary effort to bring her back upright. Long after the television cameras had left Giglio, the Costa Concordia remained exactly where she had come to rest, lying on her starboard side, half submerged, her enormous white hull visible from almost every part of the island. For local residents, the wreck became part of the landscape, a daily reminder of the night that had changed their community forever. For investigators, she remained a crime scene, and for the families of those who had died, she was something far more personal, the place where 32 lives had been lost. Removing a cruise ship isn't as simple as towing it away. The Costa Concordia weighed more than 114,000 tons. Her hull had been badly damaged. She rested on uneven rock. One mistake could have caused the wreck to slide into much deeper water. If that happened, recovery would become vastly more difficult. It could also have created a serious environmental disaster along one of Italy's most beautiful coastlines. Fuel, chemicals, wastewater, everything still trapped inside the ship had to be considered. The operation required engineers, naval architects, divers, marine salvage specialists, environmental scientists, and hundreds of workers from around the world. What they were attempting had never been carried out on a ship of this size. The first task wasn't lifting the vessel, it was making the surrounding area safe. Divers spent months working beneath the surface. Steel platforms were secured to the seabed. Massive underwater supports were installed beneath the wreck. Every movement had to be measured, calculated, checked, then checked again. Even the weather became a deciding factor. A change in sea conditions could halt work immediately. Patience wasn't simply important, it was essential. Then came the operation everyone had been waiting for, known as parbuckling. Rather than lifting the ship vertically, engineers would slowly rotate her upright using enormous steel cables and specially constructed platforms. It sounded almost impossible, because in many ways, it was. The Concordia was no longer a perfectly balanced ship. She'd been flooded, damaged, twisted by the collision. Every ton of weight had to be accounted for. If calculations were even slightly wrong, the entire operation could fail. On the morning of the 16th of September 2013, millions of people watched live broadcasts from Giglio. Television crews gathered on the shoreline. Residents stood quietly looking out across the water. Engineers took their positions. Months of planning were about to be tested. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the giant began to move. Not meters, not even centimeters at first. Millimeters. Steel cables tightened. Hydraulic systems groaned under extraordinary pressure. Hour after hour, the wreck rotated. The movement was so slow that it was almost impossible to see with the naked eye. Yet it was happening. One of the largest ships ever salvaged was standing up again. When the operation finally succeeded, there was applause, not celebration, relief. The impossible had become possible, but bringing the ship upright revealed another heartbreaking reality. Areas that had remained underwater since the night of the disaster could now be searched properly. During those searches, the remains of several victims who had previously been missing were recovered. For their families, the operation finally brought answers, even if it couldn't bring peace. Work continued for many more months. Huge flotation tanks were attached to both sides of the vessel. Water was pumped out, air pumped in. Gradually, the Concordia became buoyant once more. Not seaworthy, never again, but capable of one final voyage. In July 2014, more than 2 years after sinking striking the rocks of Giglio, the Costa Concordia left the island for the last time. Tugboats guided her slowly across the Mediterranean to Genoa. The journey wasn't glamorous. There were no passengers, no music, no lights illuminating her decks, only a silent convoy escorting a ship that had become one of the most recognisable symbols of maritime disaster in modern history. Eventually, she was dismantled piece by piece. Thousands of tons of steel were recycled. The floating city that had once carried families on dream holidays simply ceased to exist. No museum, no memorial ship, no preserved section, only photographs, memories, and the lessons left behind. But while the Costa Concordia was gone, the legal questions remained. Investigators had gathered the evidence, witnesses had spoken, experts had delivered their conclusions. Now, the courts had to decide who should be held criminally responsible. For Captain Francesco Schettino, the hardest journey was still to come. When a disaster claims 32 lives, people naturally look for answers. Sometimes those answers are complicated, sometimes responsibility is shared across many people, and sometimes the spotlight falls on one individual. For Francesco Schettino, that spotlight never moved away. Long before the trial began, public opinion had already formed. Television stations replayed the radio exchange again and again. Newspapers printed photographs of the Costa Concordia lying helplessly against the rocks. The image of a captain ashore while his passengers were still escaping became one of the defining images of the disaster. But courtrooms don't decide guilt based on headlines. They decide it based on evidence. And the evidence filled thousands of pages. Italian prosecutors argued that the disaster wasn't caused by bad luck, it wasn't caused by the weather, and it wasn't the unavoidable consequence of mechanical failure. They said it began with a deliberate decision to sail dangerously close to Giglio Island. From there, they argued one mistake led to another. The delayed turn, the collision, the delay in ordering the evacuation, and finally, the captain leaving the ship before everyone had been rescued. Taken together, prosecutors believed those decisions amounted to criminal responsibility. The defence saw the events very differently. Schettino's lawyer argued that the disaster couldn't be reduced to one man's actions. They pointed to the complexity of commanding the vessel carrying more than 4,000 people. They argued that communication failures, bridge resource management, and organisational factors also played a part. They also highlighted one decision that few people disputed. After the collision, Schettino had managed to steer the powerless Costa Concordia towards the shallow waters of Giglio. Had the ship sunk in deep water, the loss of life could have been significantly greater. His legal team argued that this manoeuvre had saved hundreds, perhaps even thousands of lives. The court heard months of testimony. Navigation experts, maritime specialists, crew members, passengers, investigators, every bridge command, every announcement, every radio transmission was examined in extraordinary detail. Electronic navigation data was compared with witness accounts. Bridge recordings were replayed. The voyage recorder was analysed second by second. There were no shortcuts, no assumptions, only evidence. One issue dominated almost every stage of the proceedings: the evacuation. Could it have begun sooner? Investigators believe valuable time had been lost between the collision and the order to abandon ship. Those lost minutes became central to the prosecution's case, because while the Costa Concordia remained relatively stable, passengers still had the best chance of reaching the lifeboat safely. As the list increased, that opportunity disappeared. Launching lifeboats became more difficult, moving around the ship became more dangerous, and confusion spread. The other issue was impossible to ignore: the captain's departure from the ship. Schettino maintained that he hadn't intentionally abandoned the Concordia. He said he had ended up in a lifeboat after the vessel lurched unexpectedly, and that once ashore, he continued coordinating aspects of the emergency response by telephone. The prosecution disagreed. They argued that the captain's place was on the bridge, or wherever he was needed most aboard the ship. Until the evacuation had ended, the court had to weigh those competing accounts against the available evidence. In February 2015, the verdict was delivered. Francesco Schettino was found guilty of multiple offences, including causing the shipwreck, multiple counts of manslaughter, abandoning his ship before the evacuation had been completed, and providing false information to the authorities during the emergency. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. His legal team appealed the conviction. The appeals process continued for several years, but the verdict ultimately stood. In 2017, Schettino reported to prison to begin serving his sentence. For the family of those who had lost their loved ones, the verdict brought a measure of accountability, but it couldn't undo what had happened. No sentence, however lengthy, could return those who had died. No judgment could erase the memories carried by survivors. Justice and healing are not always the same thing. The Costa Concordia disaster changed more than one man's life. It forced the cruise industry to look hard at its own practices. Bridge procedures were reviewed, emergency drills were strengthened, requirements for passenger musters before departure became more consistent across the industry. Greater emphasis was placed on bridge resource management, on challenging unsafe decisions, and on ensuring that no captain, no matter how experienced, was beyond question. Because that was perhaps the most important lesson of all. Experience alone doesn't guarantee good judgment. Leadership isn't measured when everything is going well. It's measured when everything is falling apart. For Francesco Schettino, the court had delivered its verdict. For everyone else, the Costa Concordia would remain a reminder that disaster rarely begins with one catastrophic moment. More often, it begins with one decision, followed by another and another, until there's no way back. If you visit Giglio today, there is little to suggest that one of the world's most infamous maritime disasters happened just offshore. The sea is calm, fishing boats come and go, tourists wander through the narrow streets, children laugh in the harbour. Life has moved on, but for thousands of people, the events of the 13th of January 2012 will never truly be over. For the survivors, some still remember the sound before anything else. Not the shouting, not the alarms, but the deafening scrape of steel against granite. A sound that lasted only seconds, yet changed their lives forever. Others remember the silence that followed, the uncertainty, the waiting, the reassurance that everything was under control, when they already knew, deep down, that something was terribly wrong. For the families of the 32 people who lost their lives, the Costa Concordia isn't a news story. It isn't a documentary. It isn't a case study. It's an empty chair at birthdays, a missing voice at Christmas, a future that never happened. Behind every statistic was a person, someone who had booked a holiday, packed a suitcase, said goodbye to family, and expected to come home. Yet amid the tragedy, there were moments that deserved to be remembered. Crew members who stayed behind to guide frightened passengers, rescue workers who entered an unstable wreck without knowing what they would find, divers who searched flooded compartments day after day, the people of Giglio, who opened their homes to complete strangers without second thought. In a night remembered for failure, there was also extraordinary courage and extraordinary kindness. Those stories matter just as much. The Costa Concordia also changed the cruise industry. Passenger safety briefings became more rigorous and consistently held before departure. Bridge procedures were strengthened. Greater emphasis was placed on teamwork on the bridge, on questioning unsafe decisions, and on ensuring that experience never replaces good judgment. Many of the lessons written into today's safety procedures were paid for at a terrible cost. Perhaps that's why one sentence from that night still echoes around the world. Vada a bordo cazzo. Get back on board for fuck's sake. To some, those words symbolise accountability. To others, duty, responsibility, leadership. Whatever your view of Francesco Schettino, the sentence has become far bigger than the man it was directed at. It serves as a reminder that when people place their lives in someone else's hands, leadership isn't a title, it's an obligation. Looking back, it's easy to think that Costa Concordia is an inevitable disaster, but it wasn't inevitable. If the route hadn't changed, if the turn had begun sooner, if the danger had been recognised earlier, if the evacuation had started more quickly, history might have remembered the Costa Concordia as just another successful Mediterranean cruise. Instead, it became one of the defining maritime disasters of the 21st century, not because of a storm, not because of an act of nature, but because a chain of human decisions. As always, there are lessons hidden inside every case we cover. The Costa Concordia reminds us that confidence must never become complacency. The procedures exist for a reason. The questioning a risky decision isn't an act of disloyalty, it can be an act of courage, and that in moments of crisis, character reveals itself far more clearly than reputation ever can. Thank you for listening to What They Hide: Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. If today's episode has stayed with you, please consider following the podcast wherever you're listening, leaving a rating or review, or sharing the episode with someone who enjoys true crime and real-life investigations. If you'd like to help support the show, you'll find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. You can also follow the podcast on social media, or get in touch if there's a case you'd like me to investigate in a future episode. Until next time, stay curious, look closer, because sometimes the truth isn't hidden in the darkness, it's hiding in plain sight.